The gunshot that killed Jacob Turner's brother came from behind, which was the only reason Jacob survived long enough to watch Thomas die in the dust of a Santa Fe street on a scorching afternoon in August 1878. Jacob had been 23 years old that day, Thomas only 19, and the bullet meant for both of them found only one target before the shooter disappeared into the crowd of afternoon shoppers and drifters. The marshal never found the man responsible, and Jacob never stopped looking over his shoulder. He learned that day that caring about someone made you vulnerable in ways a man could not afford in New Mexico territory. Love was a liability, family was a weakness, and an open heart was an invitation for the world to tear you apart. So Jacob Turner built walls. He spent the next 5 years drifting from town to town, taking jobs as a ranch hand, a trail guide, occasionally hiring his gun out for protection work that kept his conscience reasonably clean. He never stayed anywhere long enough to make friends, never let a conversation go deeper than the weather and the quality of the local whiskey. Women approached him in saloons and dance halls, drawn by his tall frame, dark hair, and the quiet intensity in his gray eyes, but he always walked away before dawn. He sent money back to his mother in Kansas City every few months with no return address, just enough to let her know he was alive without giving her hope he might come home. By the summer of 1883, Jacob was 28 and working on a cattle ranch outside Gila Bend, Arizona territory. The town sat in a bend of the Gila River, where the desert stretched endless and brutal in every direction, a place where sensible people did not linger unless they had nowhere else to go. The ranch belonged to a man named Howard Pierce, who paid decent wages and asked few questions, which suited Jacob perfectly. He kept to himself, did his work, and spent his evenings in the bunkhouse reading by lamplight while the other hands played cards and told lies about their exploits. It was a Tuesday morning in late July when everything changed, though Jacob did not know it yet, as he rode out with 3 other ranch hands to check the water supply in the southern pastures. The summer had been brutal even by Arizona standards, and the cattle were ranging farther from the main compound in search of grass that had not been scorched brown. They found 2 steers dead from the heat near a dried creek bed and spent the morning dragging the carcasses far enough away that the smell would not spook the rest of the herd. The sun was directly overhead when they spotted the wagon. It sat tilted in an arroyo about a quarter mile from the main trail, one wheel clearly broken, the canvas cover bleached nearly white by sun and dust. Jacob noticed it first, his hand instinctively moving to the rifle on his saddle as he studied the scene for danger. No movement, no horses, no obvious signs of life. "Could be abandoned," said Martinez, one of the other hands, a stocky man from El Paso with a thick mustache and a cautious nature. "Could be a trap," countered young Billy, who at 19 saw ambushes everywhere and had not yet learned that most of life's dangers announce themselves with less subtlety. Jacob urged his horse forward without comment. The wagon was definitely occupied or had been recently. He could see fabric fluttering through a gap in the canvas, too clean to have been exposed to the elements for long. As they approached, he heard it. A woman's voice, hoarse and strained, singing something that sounded like a hymn. He dismounted 20 feet from the wagon, rifle in hand but pointed at the ground. "Hello, the wagon," he called out, keeping his voice level and unthreatening. "We are from the Pierce Ranch. Do you need help?" The singing stopped abruptly. There was a long silence, then a rustling sound, and finally the canvas parted. The woman who emerged was perhaps 24 or 25, with auburn hair falling loose from what had probably been an elaborate arrangement of pins and braids sometime in the past few days. Her dress was well made but covered in dust and sweat stains, the kind of traveling outfit a woman of some means might wear for a journey west. Her face was sunburned across the nose and cheeks, her lips cracked from dehydration, but her green eyes were sharp and focused as they fixed on Jacob. "I need several things," she said, her voice rough but surprisingly steady. "Water first, then help repairing my wheel or at least getting my belongings to the nearest town. And if one of you has any skill with medicine, my driver has a broken leg and a fever that I have been trying to manage for 2 days with limited success." Jacob felt something shift in his chest, a sensation he had not experienced in years and did not welcome now. There was no helplessness in this woman despite her dire circumstances, no crying or hysteria, just practical assessment of her needs and direct communication. He found it deeply unsettling. "Billy, give her your canteen," he said, not taking his eyes off the woman. "Martinez, check on the driver. Carson, ride back to the ranch and let Howard know we will be bringing in 2 people who need help. Tell him to have someone fetch Doc Morgan from town." The woman drank from the canteen Billy offered with careful discipline. Small sips, instead of the desperate gulping her body probably craved. "Thank you," she said after a moment. "My name is Olivia Kendrick. The man inside is Samuel Porter, who I hired in Tucson to bring me to Gila Bend. We hit a rut yesterday afternoon and broke the wheel. Samuel was trying to repair it when the wagon shifted and trapped his leg underneath. I managed to free him, but the damage was already done." "What brings you to Gila Bend, Miss Kendrick?" Jacob asked, finally lowering his rifle. "It is Mrs. Kendrick, actually. Widow. I am taking ownership of a property my late husband purchased before his death last year. A store, I believe, though I have only seen the deed and correspondence from the lawyer who handled the estate." She paused, studying Jacob with those sharp green eyes. "You are wondering why a widow would travel alone to the middle of the Arizona desert to claim a store in a town she has never seen. Your business is your own, madam, but you are curious nonetheless. The short answer is that I had no better options. The long answer is none of your concern, as you correctly identified." Despite the harshness of the words, she delivered them with a slight smile that took away most of the sting. "Now, shall we see to Samuel before the poor man suffers more than necessary?" Martinez emerged from the wagon shaking his head. "The leg looks bad, Turner. Real bad. He is burning up and talking nonsense. We need to get him to the ranch soon or he might not make the day." Jacob made his decision quickly. "We will put him on my horse. I will walk alongside and keep him steady. Miss Kendrick, you can ride with Martinez. Billy, you and Carson see if you can salvage anything from the wagon that looks important. We will send someone back with a proper wagon tomorrow to collect the rest." "Mrs. Kendrick," Olivia corrected quietly, but she was already moving to gather items from inside the wagon, showing more strength and practicality than many men Jacob had known. She emerged with a leather traveling bag, a wooden box bound with brass fittings, and a bundle of papers tied with string. "These are the essentials. The rest can wait." Getting Samuel Porter onto the horse was difficult and painful for everyone involved. The man screamed when they moved him, a sound that sent buzzards scattering from a nearby stand of rocks. His leg was clearly broken in multiple places, the flesh around the injury swollen and discolored in ways that made Jacob think of gangrene and amputations. Samuel was perhaps 40, weathered by years of hard travel, and he kept muttering about his wife in Silver City and how he needed to get home. "He will get home," Olivia said firmly, though Jacob saw the worry in her eyes. "He has to." The ride back to the Pierce Ranch took nearly 2 hours, with Jacob leading his horse at a careful walk to minimize Samuel's suffering. Olivia rode behind Martinez without complaint, despite what must have been considerable discomfort after days in a broken wagon under the desert sun. She asked intelligent questions about the ranch, the town, the climate, and the local economy, filing away information like she was preparing for a campaign rather than simply making conversation. "You said you are taking ownership of a store," Jacob said during a stretch when Samuel's moaning had quieted to labored breathing. "Which one?" According to the lawyer's letter, it is called Kendrick's Dry Goods, though it was previously known as Morrison's General Store. "My late husband purchased it from a Mr. Morrison who wanted to return east. The purchase was completed only weeks before Raymond, my husband, died in a construction accident in Denver. I did not learn about the property until the estate was settled 6 months ago." "Morrison died last winter," Jacob said, remembering the funeral he had attended primarily because everyone in town had been expected to show up. Hart gave out. "His daughter has been running the store since then, waiting for the new owner to arrive or sell to her. She will likely not be pleased to finally meet you. She wants to purchase the property." Olivia's voice sharpened with interest. "Could not raise the capital, from what I heard in town. Banks will not lend to unmarried women without a male relative to co-sign, and she has no family left in the area. That is unfortunate for her." Olivia paused, and Jacob heard something complicated in her silence. "Though I suppose my arrival is equally unfortunate from her perspective, as I have no intention of selling. The store represents my only asset and my only means of supporting myself. Sympathy does not pay for food or shelter." Jacob found himself grudgingly impressed by her clear-eyed assessment of her situation. Most women of his acquaintance, admittedly few, would have couched such practical thinking in apologies and hand-wringing about the difficulties of their position. Olivia Kendrick simply stated facts and moved forward. It was unusual and moderately attractive in a way that made Jacob consciously reinforce the walls around his feelings. They reached the Pierce Ranch in early afternoon. The sprawling collection of buildings sat on one of the few reliable water sources in the area, a spring that fed into a series of troughs and irrigation channels Howard Pierce's father had constructed 20 years earlier. The main house was adobe with a covered porch, surrounded by bunkhouses, barns, equipment sheds, and corrals containing the horses used for ranch work. Perhaps 30 people worked the ranch at various jobs, and most of them came out to watch as Jacob and the others arrived with their unexpected cargo. Howard Pierce himself emerged from the main house, a barrel-chested man in his 50s with gray threading through his dark hair and beard. "Doc Morgan is on his way," he announced before anyone could speak. "Get that man into the spare room in the main house. Mrs. Pierce is preparing cool water and clean bandages. Miss, you look like you could use water and shade yourself." "I am quite well, thank you," Olivia said, though Jacob noticed she swayed slightly as Martinez helped her down from the horse. "But I would appreciate the opportunity to wash and perhaps borrow a hat if possible. I seem to have lost mine somewhere in the desert." "Martha will help you," Howard said, gesturing to his wife who had appeared on the porch. "Turner, you and Martinez get Porter inside, the rest of you back to work. This is not a circus exhibition." The next hour passed in controlled chaos. Doc Morgan arrived, a thin man with wire-rimmed spectacles, and the perpetually exhausted look of the only physician serving a region the size of Rhode Island. He examined Samuel Porter with efficient movements while Olivia sat nearby, clean now and wearing a borrowed hat, watching with obvious anxiety. "The leg is badly broken in 3 places," Doc Morgan announced after his examination. "There is significant infection setting in." I can set the brakes and treat the infection, but honestly, the chances are not good. If the fever does not break in the next day or two, we are looking at amputation or death, possibly both. Samuel, lucid now that he was out of the direct sun and pumped full of laudanum, grasped Olivia's hand with surprising strength. "Get word to my Mary," he said, his voice thick. "Silver City. Tell her I am sorry." "You will tell her yourself when you recover," Olivia said firmly, though tears traced down her sunburned cheeks. "You are going to be fine, Samuel. You have to be." But Samuel Porter died that night, the fever burning through him too fast for Doc Morgan's treatments to take hold. He went quietly around midnight with Olivia sitting beside him, holding his hand and singing the same hymn Jacob had heard from the wagon. Jacob stood in the doorway and watched because someone needed to bear witness, and found himself wondering when this woman had last slept or eaten or allowed herself to fall apart. She seemed constructed of determination and duty, with no room for weakness. After Samuel's eyes closed for the final time and Doc Morgan confirmed he was gone, Olivia carefully folded the dead man's hands across his chest, straightened his shirt, and then walked out of the room with her back rigid and her eyes dry. She made it as far as the porch before her legs gave out. Jacob, who had followed at a distance he told himself was respectful rather than protective, caught her before she hit the wooden boards. "I am fine," she said automatically, but she was trembling against him, her body finally acknowledging what her mind had been denying. "I just need a moment." "You need rest and food," Jacob said, surprised by the gentleness in his own voice. "When did you last eat something substantial?" "I do not remember. 2 days ago, perhaps. There was not much food in the wagon, and I gave most of it to Samuel." She tried to pull away but did not quite manage it. "He died anyway. I failed to keep him alive, and now I must write to his wife and tell her that her husband perished in the desert delivering me to claim a store I have never seen. She will hate me, and she will be right to do so. His leg was crushed and infection set in too fast." Doc Morgan said there was nothing more anyone could have done. Jacob found himself still holding Olivia and forced himself to release her and step back. Samuel Porter made a living taking risks by guiding people through dangerous territory. He knew the hazards. "That is a very logical and utterly unhelpful observation, Mr. Turner." Olivia straightened, wiping at her eyes with the back of her hand. "I am sure you are correct, but it does not change the fact that a man is dead because I needed to reach Gila Bend. People die. Usually for stupider reasons than helping a widow claim her property." The words came out harsher than Jacob intended, roughened by memories of Thomas bleeding out in a Santa Fe street. Tearing yourself apart over it helps no one. Olivia studied him with those sharp green eyes, and Jacob had the uncomfortable sensation of being seen in ways he did not appreciate. "You are speaking from experience, I think. Someone you cared about died and you decided the safest response was to stop caring about anyone. How is that working for you, Mr. Turner?" "Better than the alternative," Jacob said shortly, and walked away before she could respond or before he could explain that the alternative had involved 5 years of nightmares and a constant awareness of how easily the people you loved could be ripped away. He did not owe Olivia Kendrick his history, and he definitely did not owe her access to the careful emotional distance he had cultivated. They buried Samuel Porter the next morning in the small cemetery behind the Pierce Ranch's main compound. Howard Pierce said a few words about duty and sacrifice, and Doc Morgan added a prayer he clearly did not believe, but recited with professional competence. Olivia stood still and silent throughout, wearing a black dress Martha Pierce had found somewhere, and afterward, She personally carved Samuel's name and dates into a wooden marker that would last perhaps 5 years before the desert wind eroded it to nothing. Jacob watched from a distance and told himself he was not developing a fascination with this complicated woman. That afternoon, Howard Pierce arranged for one of his hands to drive Olivia into Gila Bend in a proper wagon, with all her belongings from the broken wreck retrieved and loaded carefully. Jacob found himself volunteering to accompany them, telling himself it was simply practical to ensure Mrs. Kendrick made it to town safely, and ignoring Martinez's knowing look. The ride into Gila Bend took just over an hour along a rough trail that passed through desert scrubland, dotted with saguaro cactus and mesquite. Olivia spent most of the journey in silence, occasionally asking questions about the town or the territory that Jacob answered with more detail than strictly necessary. She was intelligent and observant, processing information quickly and making connections that impressed him despite his determination not to be impressed. Gila Bend was exactly what one would expect from an Arizona Territory town that existed primarily to service the ranches and mines in the surrounding area. One main street lined with false-fronted buildings, a handful of cross streets with residences and smaller businesses, and a constant layer of dust over everything. Perhaps 300 people lived in or near the town, with a steady flow of travelers passing through on their way to Yuma or Tucson, or other destinations that promised better prospects than this bend in a muddy river. The store that Olivia had inherited sat on the main street between the telegraph office and a milliner's shop that seemed optimistic about the local market for fashionable hats. It was a solid building with large windows displaying a random assortment of goods, and a sign that had been repainted to read Kendrick's Dry Goods in neat black letters. A smaller sign in the window read Open under new management. "She works fast," Jacob observed, nodding toward the sign. "Morrison's daughter, I mean. She must have received word that you were in the area. Then I should introduce myself immediately and clarify the situation before rumors make everything more complicated." Olivia climbed down from the wagon with Jacob's assistance and straightened her dress. "Will you accompany me, Mr. Turner? I suspect having a witness might prove useful." Jacob knew he should decline, knew he should unhitch the wagon and disappear back to the ranch where he could maintain his careful isolation. Instead, he heard himself saying, "Of course," and followed Olivia into the store. The interior was larger than it appeared from outside, with shelves and tables displaying everything from canned goods to fabric to farming equipment. The organization seemed haphazard, as though things had been placed wherever space existed rather than according to any logical system. Behind the main counter stood a woman perhaps 30 years old with brown hair pulled into a severe bun, and a dress that had been mended many times. Her expression when she saw Olivia was complicated, mixing resentment and exhaustion and a kind of desperate hope that things might somehow work out differently than expected. "You must be Mrs. Kendrick," the woman said without preamble. "I am Catherine Morrison. I assume you are here to claim the property." "I am, though I want to be clear that I had no idea my late husband had purchased this store until months after his death. I understand you have been maintaining the business and that you hope to purchase it yourself. I am sorry the circumstances worked against you." Olivia spoke directly and honestly, which Jacob suspected was both kinder and more painful than polite deflection would have been. "My father ran this store for 20 years. I have been working here since I was 14 years old. I know every supplier, every customer, every trick to keeping inventory during a drought or managing accounts when the ranchers cannot pay until they sell their cattle." Catherine's voice remained level, but her knuckles were white where she gripped the counter. "You are from Denver, according to the lawyer's letter. What do you know about running a store in the Arizona desert?" "Nothing," Olivia admitted. "But I learn quickly and I am not too proud to ask for help from someone who has experience. I own this property, Miss Morrison, and I will not sell it because it represents my only means of supporting myself. However, I also recognize that I cannot run it successfully without understanding the community and the business. So I have a proposition for you." Catherine's expression shifted to wary interest. "What kind of proposition?" "Continue managing the store as you have been. Teach me everything you know about the business and the customers and the suppliers. In exchange, I will pay you a fair salary and a percentage of the profits, with a contract that guarantees your position for at least 2 years. At the end of that period, if you still want to own the store and have raised the capital, I will consider selling it to you at a fair price." The offer was more generous than Jacob expected, and clearly more than Catherine expected as well. The woman blinked rapidly, her defensive posture softening slightly. "Why would you do that? You could simply fire me and try to run it yourself." "I could, and we would both likely fail. You would lose your income, and I would lose my investment because I would have no idea what I was doing. This way we both benefit." Olivia paused, then added quietly, "I know what it is like to be a woman with limited options, Miss Morrison. I am not interested in making your situation worse just because circumstances gave me an advantage I did nothing to earn." Catherine studied Olivia for a long moment, and Jacob watched two women silently assess each other and apparently find something worth respecting. 15% of the profits," Catherine said finally. "And I want the right to make purchasing decisions without requiring your approval for amounts under $50. You can watch and learn, but I will not have you questioning every decision while I am trying to keep this business running." "Done." Olivia extended her hand and Catherine shook it firmly. "When can we start reviewing the accounts?" "Tomorrow morning. Today you should find somewhere to stay. The boarding house 2 streets over takes female lodgers and Mrs. Chen, who runs it, is honest, which is rarer than you might think." Catherine hesitated, then added in a slightly warmer tone, "Welcome to Gila Bend, Mrs. Kendrick. I hope you survive the experience." Jacob helped Olivia transport her belongings to the boarding house, a tidy adobe building with a small garden that somehow produced vegetables despite the brutal climate. Mrs. Chen, a Chinese woman who had followed her husband to the Arizona silver mines before his death in a collapse, took one look at Olivia and quoted a weekly rate that was high but not exploitative. "You are the new store owner," Mrs. Chen said, statement rather than question. "Catherine Morrison spoke with me earlier. You have good reputation already for being fair. Your room is upstairs, faces east, so morning sun but cooler in afternoon. Meals included, wash water extra." "Thank you, Mrs. Chen. That sounds perfect." Olivia counted out money for 2 weeks in advance, which seemed to seal her acceptance. "I appreciate you taking me in on such short notice. Women must help women," Mrs. Chen said with a slight shrug. "Men mostly useless, except for lifting heavy things and occasionally being pleasant to look at. Speaking of which, your cowboy is leaving. You should thank him properly." Jacob felt his face heat as both women turned to look at him. "I am not her cowboy," he said stiffly. "I was simply ensuring Mrs. Kendrick made it to town safely." "Of course, Mrs. Chen said with a knowing smile that made Jacob feel like he was 13 and being teased by his older sister. "Very noble. Much chivalrous. You go now before you say something stupid and ruin good impression." Olivia followed Jacob outside, leaving Mrs. Chen chuckling behind them. The afternoon sun was brutal, and Jacob found himself studying the way light caught in Olivia's auburn hair before he forced his attention back to the wagon. "Thank you, Mr. Turner," Olivia said, her formality a stark contrast to Mrs. Chen's blunt assessment. "You have been very kind these past 2 days, and I am grateful. I am sure you have work to return to at the ranch." "I do," Jacob agreed, but found himself not moving toward the wagon. "Will you be all right here? Gila Bend is not exactly Denver." "I stopped expecting to be all right when my husband died and left me with debt and one unexpected asset in the middle of the Arizona desert," Olivia said with a slight smile that did not reach her eyes. "But I will survive, Mr. Turner. I am apparently very good at surviving whether I want to be or not." Jacob recognized the exhaustion in her voice because he had heard it in his own for 5 years. "Surviving is not the same as living," he said, then immediately regretted the observation because it was too personal and revealed too much. "No, it is not," Olivia agreed, studying him with those sharp green eyes that seemed to see past every defense he had carefully constructed. "But sometimes surviving is the best we can manage until we remember what living feels like. Good afternoon, Mr. Turner. I hope I will see you again when you come to town." She went inside before he could respond, which was probably for the best since Jacob had no idea what he would have said. He drove the wagon back to the Pierce Ranch in a thoroughly unsettled state, annoyed at himself for caring whether Olivia Kendrick successfully established herself in Gila Bend, and even more annoyed that he was already planning excuses to return to town sooner than necessary. Over the next several weeks, Jacob found himself riding into Gila Bend with suspicious frequency. He told himself, and anyone who asked, that he was picking up supplies, checking on the mail, or conducting business for Howard Pierce, who definitely had not requested any such thing. The truth, which Jacob avoided examining too closely, was that he wanted to see how Olivia was managing, and that desire unsettled him more than he cared to admit. Olivia, it turned out, was managing remarkably well. She spent long hours at the store learning the business from Catherine Morrison, the two women developing a partnership based on mutual respect and complementary skills. Catherine understood the customers and the rhythms of the local economy, while Olivia brought organizational skills and a head for numbers that identified inefficiencies and opportunities Catherine had been too overwhelmed to address. The store began to show visible improvements, with better organization of inventory and expanded stock of items that actually sold rather than gathering dust on shelves. Jacob watched from a distance he told himself was appropriate, occasionally stopping by the store for purchases he did not particularly need and finding excuses to linger. Olivia was always polite, occasionally warm, but maintained her own careful boundaries that matched his. They circled each other like wary animals, attracted and afraid in equal measure. It was late September when circumstances forced them into closer proximity. Jacob had ridden into town to actually pick up supplies Howard Pierce needed, and was loading bags of grain onto his wagon when he noticed a commotion outside the saloon. 3 men were harassing a woman Jacob did not recognize, their hands too familiar and their laughter too loud. He was trying to decide if intervention was necessary or simply trouble he did not need when Olivia emerged from the store and marched directly toward the group. "Excuse me, gentlemen," she said with absolutely no apology in her tone. "The lady clearly does not appreciate your attention. Perhaps you should direct your energies elsewhere." The largest of the 3 men, a drifter Jacob had seen around town causing minor trouble, turned to look at Olivia with exaggerated surprise. "Well now, the new store lady wants to tell us how to behave." "That is adorable, honey, but this is not your concern," I am making it my concern." Olivia stepped between the men and the woman they had been harassing, who took the opportunity to hurry away down the street. "The lady has left. Find someone who actually wants your company, or go sleep off whatever you have been drinking." Jacob was already moving before the drifter reached for Olivia, crossing the street in 3 long strides. He caught the man's wrist before his hand connected with Olivia's arm and applied just enough pressure to make his point without breaking bone. "The lady asked you to leave," Jacob said quietly, his voice carrying the kind of certainty that made smart men reconsider their choices. "I suggest you do that now." The drifter looked at Jacob's hand on his wrist, then at Jacob's face, and apparently decided this fight was not worth having. "We were just having fun. No harm meant." "Then no harm done. Walk away." Jacob released the man's wrist and waited while all 3 drifters shuffled off toward the saloon, muttering insults that were meant to save face rather than start actual conflict. Olivia let out a long breath and turned to face Jacob. "Thank you, though I had the situation under control." "Did you? Because it looked like you were about to get yourself hurt defending a stranger." "So you were defending a stranger as well by that logic. Why is it acceptable for you but foolish for me?" "Because I cannot stand the thought of you being hurt," Jacob thought but absolutely did not say. Instead he said, "Because I am bigger and armed and experienced with dangerous men. You are none of those things. I am beginning to think you have a very limited view of what women are capable of, Mr. Turner." Olivia's tone was tart, but her eyes were warm. "However, I do appreciate your intervention regardless of your questionable reasoning. May I buy you dinner as thanks? Mrs. Chen is making something that involves duck and noodles, and she always cooks enough to feed a small army." Jacob knew he should decline. Dinner was personal in ways that their careful public interactions had not been, and accepting felt like crossing a line he had spent 5 years maintaining. But he was tired of lines and walls and the careful isolation that had kept him safe and miserable. And Olivia was looking at him with an expression that suggested she knew exactly what internal debate he was conducting. "Duck and noodles sound good," he heard himself say, and watched something pleased and slightly surprised cross Olivia's face before she smiled. Dinner at Mrs. Chen's boarding house was indeed duck and noodles, along with vegetables from the garden and rice prepared in a style Mrs. Chen said her mother had taught her in Canton before the family emigrated to California. They ate at a small table in the kitchen rather than the formal dining room where the other boarders took their meals, creating an intimacy that felt both comfortable and dangerous. "Tell me about yourself, Mr. Turner," Olivia said after they had exhausted safe topics like the weather and the quality of the food. "Where are you from originally? Do you have family?" "Kansas City. My mother is still there. My father died 10 years ago. I have a sister who married a lawyer and has 3 children who I have never met." Jacob paused, then added with the bluntness that seemed to characterize all his interactions with Olivia, "I had a brother. He was killed 5 years ago in New Mexico. I was with him when it happened." Olivia set down her fork and gave him her full attention. "I am so sorry. Can you tell me what happened, or would you prefer not to discuss it?" Most people let him stop there, accepting his sparse information without pushing for details. Olivia simply waited, her green eyes steady and patient, and Jacob found himself talking about things he had not spoken of in 5 years. His name was Thomas. He was 19. I was 23. We were passing through Santa Fe, planning to find work on one of the big ranches further north. Thomas had this idea that we could save enough money to buy our own land, maybe start a horse breeding operation. He was always good with horses. Jacob stopped, the memory of Thomas's laugh and terrible singing suddenly vivid. Someone shot him in the street. From behind, no warning, no reason that anyone could determine. The marshal thought maybe it was a case of mistaken identity, that the shooter meant to kill someone else. Thomas died before the doctor arrived. I held him, and there was nothing I could do except watch him bleed out in the dust. And you decided that caring about people was too dangerous, Olivia said quietly. That the only way to protect yourself from that kind of pain was to stop letting people matter to you. It seemed logical at the time. It seems lonely all the time. Olivia reached across the table and placed her hand over his, a gesture of comfort that Jacob felt all the way through his carefully constructed defenses. I understand the impulse, truly. After Raymond died and I discovered that, instead of the comfortable life he had promised, we had nothing but debts and this one strange asset, I wanted to shut down too. I wanted to rage at him for lying to me, for leaving me in such an impossible situation, for dying before I could make him explain why he thought gambling and speculation were more important than providing for his wife. But you did not shut down. I did for a while. Several months where I barely functioned, just going through the motions of settling the estate and dealing with creditors, and trying to figure out what to do with a general store in an Arizona town I had never heard of. She smiled slightly, her thumb moving against the back of Jacob's hand in a way that made concentration difficult. Then I realized that Raymond's greatest cruelty was not dying or leaving me in debt. It was making me believe that I needed him to survive, that I was incapable of managing without a man to direct my life. So I decided to prove him wrong. I came here determined to succeed out of pure spite, and found instead that I actually enjoyed the challenge. "You are remarkable," Jacob said, then felt his face heat at the admission. "I mean, your ability to adapt is impressive. Admirable. Not many people could have handled your situation with such grace." "I believe you meant to say I am remarkable, Mr. Turner, and I am choosing to take that compliment at face value before you talk yourself out of it." Olivia squeezed his hand once before releasing it, leaving Jacob's skin feeling cold where she had touched it. "The truth is that we are both doing the same thing. We both experienced loss that terrified us, and we are both trying to figure out how to keep living despite that fear. The difference is that I decided fear was not a good enough reason to stop trying to connect with people, while you are still letting it control your choices." Jacob wanted to argue, to defend his carefully maintained isolation as wisdom rather than cowardice. But sitting across from Olivia, with the taste of duck and noodles still on his tongue and the memory of her hand on his still warming his skin, he could not quite convince himself she was wrong. "I do not know how to do anything different," he admitted finally. "I have been alone so long it feels like the only option. You are having dinner with me right now. That seems like a start." Olivia smiled, and Jacob felt something crack in the walls he had built around his heart. "Perhaps you could consider having dinner with me again sometime. Mrs. Chen is making tamales next week, and I have learned that eating alone is both boring and depressing." "Tamales sound good," Jacob said, and watched Olivia's smile widen into something bright and genuine that made his chest ache in ways he had forgotten were possible. Over the next several months, Jacob found his life developing patterns he had successfully avoided for 5 years. He had dinner at Mrs. Chen's boarding house with increasing frequency, officially as thanks for various small services he provided, like repairing a broken step or helping move heavy inventory at the store, but really because both he and Olivia had stopped pretending they did not enjoy each other's company. He helped at Kendrick's dry goods during busy periods, using his height to reach high shelves and his strength to load and unload supply wagons. He escorted Olivia to church on Sundays, then to the small restaurant that served decent food and terrible coffee afterward. The people of Gila Bend began to view them as a unit. Jacob and Olivia, the cowboy and the widow, the man who never smiled and the woman who had won smiles from him anyway. Jacob found he did not mind the assumption as much as he should have, and that realization was both terrifying and strangely liberating. It was November before they had their first real fight. Jacob had been helping at the store when two men arrived looking for work and supplies on credit, a common enough request during the slow season when ranch work was scarce. Catherine Morrison was prepared to extend the credit based on her knowledge of the men's reliability, but Olivia hesitated over the amount they were requesting. "That is more than twice what we normally extend for this type of arrangement," she said, running her finger down the ledger where previous credit transactions were recorded. "I am concerned about overextending our accounts before winter when payment becomes even less certain." "These are good men who have dealt with us for years," Catherine argued. "Refusing them now seems short-sighted when we know they will pay us back in the spring." Jacob stayed out of the discussion until one of the men, a hand named Cooper who worked at a ranch north of town, turned to him directly. "What do you think, Turner? You know how it is out there. We need supplies to get through the winter, and the ranch is between payrolls until the spring cattle sales." "I think Mrs. Kendrick is the owner and what she says goes," Jacob said, keeping his voice neutral. "But if you are asking my opinion, extending credit during tight times is how most stores end up in trouble. Better to find a middle ground that helps you out without putting her business at risk." Olivia and Catherine eventually worked out a compromise that provided the men with essential supplies at a reduced credit amount, with an option to purchase additional items at the end of December if their situation improved. The men left satisfied, but Olivia was clearly annoyed when she turned to face Jacob after they had gone. "I did not need you to speak for me," she said quietly, waiting until Catherine had moved to the back of the store before continuing. "I appreciate your support, but telling those men that what I say goes implies that I need your validation to exercise my own authority." "I was trying to help," Jacob said, confused by her reaction. "You seemed uncertain and they were pushing back." "I was not uncertain. I was thinking through the implications before making a decision, which is what a responsible business owner does. You deciding to step in and resolve the situation sent a message that my authority requires male confirmation." Olivia's voice remained level, but her eyes flashed with genuine anger. "I like you, Jacob, and I value your help. But I did not come to Arizona and work this hard to rebuild my life just to have another man take over my decision-making, even with the best intentions." The use of his first name, which she had been doing for weeks now in private but rarely in public, made the criticism sting more rather than less. "I am sorry," Jacob said stiffly. "I was trying to be supportive. I will not make that mistake again. Now you are being deliberately obtuse." Olivia stepped closer, lowering her voice further. "I am not angry that you have opinions or that you expressed one when asked directly. I am asking you to be aware of how your interventions, however well meant, can undermine my authority in front of customers and Catherine. I need people to respect my judgment, and that becomes harder when the man everyone knows I am spending time with jumps in to settle disputes." Jacob processed this, forcing down his defensive instinct to argue and actually considering what Olivia was saying. She was right, he realized. He had stepped in to fix a situation that was not actually a crisis, operating from the assumption that Olivia needed his help rather than trusting her to manage her own business. "You are right," he said after a long moment. "I apologize. I reacted from habit rather than thinking about how it would look or what you needed. I will be more careful going forward." The tension in Olivia's shoulders eased slightly. "Thank you. I know you were trying to help, and I appreciate that your instinct is to support me. I just need that support to look different sometimes." "Tell me how," Jacob said, meaning it. "I am not good at this, at relationships or partnerships or whatever this is between us, but I want to learn." Something soft and complicated crossed Olivia's face. "This is already more than I expected, Jacob Turner. A man who listens when I explain what I need and apologizes when he makes a mistake. That is practically miraculous by my experience. We will figure out the rest as we go." They did figure it out, through more conversations and occasional arguments, and the slow, careful process of two damaged people learning to trust each other. Jacob discovered that Olivia had a sharp sense of humor that emerged when she was tired, and that she sang while doing inventory in a voice that was not particularly good but was enthusiastic. Olivia learned that Jacob was surprisingly well-read despite his limited formal education, and that he had a gift for sketching that he dismissed as useless, but that produced remarkably detailed drawings of horses and landscapes. December brought cold nights and occasionally freezing mornings, unusual for Gila Bend but not unprecedented. Jacob spent Christmas Eve at the boarding house, where Mrs. Chen had organized a dinner for her residents that included roasted chicken and vegetables, and a cake that had required mysterious ingredients shipped from San Francisco. Olivia gave him a book of poetry she had ordered from Tucson, and Jacob gave her a leather-bound journal he had commissioned from the saddle maker, along with a sketch he had drawn of the store that showed it in better detail than any photograph could capture. "This is beautiful," Olivia said quietly, studying the sketch with an expression Jacob could not quite read. "You see things so clearly. I think most people look at the store and just see a building, but you drew it like it matters. It does matter. To you and to Catherine, and to the people who depend on it." Jacob paused, then added with the honesty that characterized everything between them, "And it matters to me because it matters to you." Olivia looked up from the sketch, her green eyes bright in the lamplight. "I am going to kiss you now, Jacob Turner. If you have objections, you should voice them in the next 3 seconds." Jacob had no objections. The kiss was soft and careful and tasted like cake and promise, and when they broke apart, he found himself smiling in a way he had not smiled in 5 years. "Well," Olivia said, slightly breathless, "that was overdue." "Considerably," Jacob agreed, and kissed her again because apparently that was something he could do now, something he wanted to do with a fierceness that would have terrified him months earlier, but now felt like the most natural thing in the world. They courted properly after that, which in Gila Bend meant being seen together at church and social events, and taking walks along the river when the weather permitted. Jacob spent less time at the Pierce Ranch and more time in town, eventually moving into a room at the boarding house because the ride back and forth was becoming impractical. Howard Pierce accepted his resignation with knowing amusement, and a request that Jacob still help out during busy seasons, which Jacob agreed to because ranch work paid well, and the extra income would be useful for the future he was beginning to envision. That future took clearer shape in early March when Jacob proposed to Olivia on the porch of the boarding house, as they watched the sunset turn the desert into shades of gold and purple. He had no ring, no elaborate plan, just the sudden certainty that he wanted to spend his life with this woman who had somehow convinced him that opening his heart was worth the risk. "Marry me," he said, interrupting Olivia's commentary about a dispute with a supplier over the quality of some fabric shipment. "I love you and I want to build a life with you. I know I am not wealthy and I come with considerable emotional baggage, but I will work hard and I will never lie to you, and I will try my best to be the kind of partner you deserve." Olivia stared at him for a long moment, then started laughing in a way that made Jacob deeply uncertain about her answer. "That is possibly the least romantic and most honest proposal in the history of marriage proposals," she said when she could speak again. "Of course I will marry you, you ridiculous man. I have been in love with you since you caught me on this porch when I collapsed from exhaustion after Samuel died, and you told me that tearing myself apart helps no one. You saw me clearly even then, and you have been seeing me clearly ever since." "So that is a yes?" Jacob asked, wanting to be absolutely certain. "That is an enthusiastic yes, with the caveat that I am keeping the store and my independence and my own name for business purposes." Olivia stood on her toes to kiss him soundly. "I am not looking for someone to take care of me, Jacob. I am looking for someone to build a partnership with, someone who respects what I have accomplished and wants to create something bigger together." "That is all I want," Jacob said honestly. "I spent 5 years trying to be alone, and it turns out I am terrible at it. I would much rather spend the rest of my life being terrible at being alone with you." They married in April at the small church in Gila Bend, with Catherine Morrison standing as Olivia's witness and Howard Pierce standing as Jacob's. Mrs. Chen provided food for a reception that included half the town, and the local minister gave a short sermon about love and second chances that made several people cry, including Jacob, though he would deny it later. Married life suited them both in ways that surprised exactly no one except perhaps themselves. Jacob became a full partner in the store, handling the physical labor and supplier negotiations that played to his strengths, while Olivia managed the accounts and customer relations that played to hers. They moved into a small house on the edge of town that had belonged to a prospector who gave up and returned to Missouri, and spent their evenings reading or talking or simply sitting in comfortable silence. It was not always easy. Jacob had nightmares sometimes, waking in a panic from dreams of Thomas dying or Olivia bleeding out in the street. Olivia occasionally pushed herself too hard, trying to prove she could handle everything herself, until Jacob learned to recognize the signs and gently insist she accept help. They argued about money and business decisions, and whose turn it was to deal with the chickens they had acquired for fresh eggs. But they also laughed together, sometimes so hard that Mrs. Chen complained about the noise from next door where she had moved after selling the boarding house to a couple from Ohio. They made plans for the future, talking about expanding the store or perhaps opening a second location in another town. They worked alongside each other, learning the rhythms of partnership and compromise and the strange intimacy of building something together. In late June, Olivia told Jacob she was pregnant. They were closing up the store for the evening, going through the familiar routine of checking inventory and locking the cash box, when she simply stopped in the middle of counting receipts and said, "I am going to have a baby." Doc Morgan confirmed it this afternoon. Jacob dropped the broom he had been holding. "You are sure?" "Quite sure. He says the baby will likely arrive in January, though these things are apparently not precise." Olivia watched him carefully, and Jacob realized she was uncertain about his reaction. "I know we did not specifically plan this, but I am pleased about it." "Are you?" "I am terrified," Jacob said honestly, then crossed to where Olivia stood and pulled her into a careful embrace. "And yes, I am pleased. More than pleased. I am astounded and grateful and absolutely convinced I will do everything wrong. Then we will do everything wrong together, which sounds much better than doing it alone." Olivia relaxed against him. "I am terrified too, but also excited. I think that is normal." Their son was born on a cold night in late January 1885. arriving after 12 hours of labor that left Olivia exhausted, and Jacob deeply grateful for Doc Morgan's competence and Mrs. Chen's practical assistance. They named him Thomas Raymond Turner, honoring Jacob's brother and Olivia's late husband, and found that the baby had his mother's green eyes and an impressive set of lungs. Parenthood was exactly as difficult and rewarding as everyone had warned them it would be. Thomas was colicky and demanded constant attention, and Jacob discovered that he could function on remarkably little sleep when necessary. Olivia returned to work at the store after 2 months, with Catherine delighted to help with childcare during busy periods and Mrs. Chen establishing herself as an honorary grandmother who provided unsolicited advice and an endless supply of patience. The years passed in a blur of small moments and gradual changes. Thomas grew into a curious toddler who loved horses and books in equal measure. The store expanded into the adjacent building when the milliner finally admitted defeat and returned east, allowing them to separate dry goods from hardware and farming supplies in a way that made the business more efficient. Jacob's mother visited from Kansas City and fell in love with her grandson and her daughter-in-law, staying for 3 months before reluctantly returning home. In the summer of 1887, Olivia gave birth to their second child, a daughter they named Sarah Catherine, combining both their mothers' names. Sarah was a calmer baby than Thomas had been, but demanded attention in different ways, and Jacob found himself completely devoted to his daughter in ways that would have embarrassed his younger self. Catherine Morrison married the deputy sheriff in the fall of 1888, and Jacob and Olivia threw them a wedding party at the store that became legendary in Gila Bend for the amount of food and dancing involved. Catherine remained a full partner in the business, now expanded to include a small restaurant section that served lunch to workers from surrounding ranches. By 1890, Jacob was 35 and Olivia 31, and they had built a life in Gila Bend that felt solid and real in ways Jacob had stopped believing were possible. He no longer woke from nightmares of Thomas dying, though he sometimes dreamed of that day and felt the old grief fresh and sharp. But now he woke to Olivia beside him, and to children down the hall, and to a community that had become home. And the grief was manageable because it existed alongside love rather than in its absence. One evening in late March, after the children were asleep and the store was closed for the night, Jacob and Olivia sat on the porch of their house watching the sunset paint the desert in shades of fire. It was their ritual, this quiet time together at the end of each day, and Jacob valued it more than almost anything else in his life. "Do you ever regret it?" Olivia asked suddenly, breaking the comfortable silence. "Letting me past your walls? Opening yourself up to all this risk and potential pain? Would it have been easier to stay guarded?" Jacob considered the question seriously, thinking about the man he had been when he first saw Olivia emerging from that broken wagon in the desert. That man had been safe and isolated and fundamentally alone, protected from pain by refusing to let anyone matter. That man would have watched Olivia drive away into town and never looked back, would have continued drifting from job to job and place to place, never building anything or committing to anyone. "Easier," Jacob said finally. "Maybe. Better, not even slightly. I was surviving before I met you, but I was not living. You taught me the difference, and I will be grateful for that until the day I die." "That is quite romantic for a man who once told me that people die and tearing yourself apart over it helps no one," Olivia said with a smile. "I was an idiot who confused self-protection with wisdom," Jacob said, pulling Olivia closer against his side. "Thank God you were stubborn enough to make me see the difference." "I prefer to think of it as persistent rather than stubborn," Olivia said, "though the result is the same." We found each other despite our best efforts to stay isolated, and somehow managed to build something wonderful. Not somehow. Because of you. Because you looked at a man who had given up on connection and decided he was worth the effort anyway. Jacob kissed the top of Olivia's head, breathing in the familiar scent of her hair and the soap she used. I love you. More than I thought it was possible to love anyone. And I am so grateful I was there the day your wagon broke down, and that I was too curious to just ride away. I love you too, Olivia said quietly. Even when you are stubborn and overthinking everything and trying to protect me from problems I am perfectly capable of solving myself. Especially then, Jacob agreed, and they sat together as the sun finished setting and the stars began to emerge. Two people who had learned that the greatest courage was not in staying guarded, but in choosing to open your heart, despite every reason to keep it closed. The years continued their steady march forward. Thomas grew into a serious boy who loved working with the horses. Jacob kept behind their house and showed early talent for drawing that made his father proud. Sarah became a whirlwind of energy and opinions, inheriting her mother's sharp mind and her father's tendency toward careful observation. In 1892, Olivia gave birth to their third child, another son they named William James Turner after Jacob's father. William was a placid baby who seemed content to observe the chaos around him with mild interest, and Catherine Morrison joked that he was clearly the smartest of the three children since he had figured out early that causing less trouble meant more peace. The store continued to prosper, becoming a central fixture of Gila Bend's economy and a gathering place for the community. Jacob and Olivia expanded again in 1894, purchasing the telegraph office when the operator retired and incorporating postal services into their operation. It was more work, but also more stability, and they hired additional staff including two young women from town who needed employment and proved to be quick learners. Jacob's mother visited regularly now, making the journey from Kansas City twice a year to spend time with her grandchildren and the daughter-in-law she adored. She told Jacob during her visit in the spring of 1895 that she had never seen him so happy, so settled, and that Thomas would have been proud of the life his brother had built. "I think about him every day," Jacob admitted as they sat together watching the children play in the yard. Not with the same sharp pain as before, but with love and gratitude for the time we had. Olivia helped me understand that honoring his memory meant living fully rather than shutting down. "She is a remarkable woman," his mother said. "I am glad you were smart enough to recognize that and stubborn enough to pursue her despite your determination to stay isolated." "I was not actually that smart or stubborn," Jacob said with a smile. "Olivia did most of the work of convincing me I was capable of opening my heart again. I just eventually stopped fighting it." By the turn of the century, Jacob was 45 and Olivia 41, and they had become pillars of the Gila Bend community in ways neither had anticipated when they first met. Thomas was 15 and working part-time at a neighboring ranch, learning the skills that might lead to his own spread someday. Sarah was 13 and already helping manage the store's accounts, showing the same head for business her mother possessed. William was 8 and dividing his time between school and drawing everything he encountered with remarkable detail. They had survived droughts and economic downturns, personal losses and community tragedies, always supporting each other through the difficulties and celebrating the victories together. The store had become Kendrick and Turner General Store and Post Office, reflecting the true partnership they had built. Their house had been expanded twice to accommodate their growing family and was always filled with noise and life and love. One evening in June 1901, As they once again sat on their porch watching the sunset, Olivia took Jacob's hand and laced their fingers together in the familiar gesture that still sent warmth through his chest. "You remember the night you proposed?" she asked. "You told me you wanted to build a life with me, and you promised to work hard and never lie and try to be the kind of partner I deserved." "I remember," Jacob said. "I was terrified you would say no. I was never going to say no. I had already decided you were worth keeping, even if you were still figuring that out yourself." Olivia smiled at him, her green eyes bright in the fading light. "You kept your promises, Jacob Turner. You worked hard and you never lied, and you became exactly the kind of partner I needed, even on the days when we drove each other crazy." "We built something good," Jacob agreed, looking at the house behind them where their children were finishing dinner and arguing about whose turn it was to wash dishes. "Better than I ever imagined possible when I was drifting from place to place, trying to convince myself that being alone was preferable to risking my heart." "We built something extraordinary," Olivia corrected. "A family, a business, a life that matters to each other and to this community. And we did it by choosing courage over fear, over and over again, even when fear seemed like the safer option." Jacob pulled Olivia close, kissing her with the ease and familiarity of nearly 2 decades together, but also with the same desire and connection he had felt that first night at Mrs. Chen's boarding house when he realized he was falling in love despite his best efforts to stay guarded. "I choose you," he said when they broke apart. "Every day for the rest of my life, I choose you and this life we built together. Thank you for not giving up on me when I was too scared to risk opening my heart." "Thank you for eventually letting me in," Olivia replied, "and for showing me that trusting someone does not mean surrendering my independence or my strength. We saved each other, Jacob, from loneliness and isolation, and the false belief that protecting ourselves from pain was worth missing out on love." They sat together as the stars emerged and the desert night settled around them, two people who had learned that the greatest risk was not in loving too much but in refusing to love at all. Behind them, their children laughed and argued and lived their loud, chaotic lives. Below them in town, the store they had built together sat ready for another day of service to their community. Around them spread the Arizona desert that had seemed so hostile and unforgiving when they first arrived, but had become home through the simple act of choosing to build a life there together. Jacob Turner had believed hearts stayed guarded because opening them invited pain and loss, and the kind of vulnerability he could not survive again. But Olivia Kendrick had taught him that a guarded heart was not actually safe at all. It was simply closed to all the beauty and joy and connection that made life worth living. So he had chosen to let guarded become open, and in doing so had found not the disaster he feared but the happiness he had stopped believing he deserved. It was, he thought as Olivia's head rested against his shoulder and the night air cooled around them, the best decision he had ever made. The years continued their steady progression. Thomas eventually took over management of a ranch east of Gila Bend, marrying a schoolteacher named Marie and starting his own family. Sarah went east for college, an unusual choice that Jacob and Olivia supported despite their worry, and returned with a degree in business and enough new ideas to modernize the store's operations. William pursued his art, eventually becoming known for his paintings of Western landscapes that captured the stark beauty of the Arizona desert. Jacob and Olivia worked together until they were both in their 60s, finally handing over daily management of the store to Sarah and her husband, while remaining involved in major decisions. They became grandparents 7 times over, and their home remained a gathering place for family celebrations and Sunday dinners that required multiple tables and endless food. On their 30th wedding anniversary in April 1915, Jacob commissioned a painting from William showing the store as it had looked when Olivia first arrived in Gila Bend, before the expansions and improvements, when it was just one uncertain widow and her determination to survive. Next to it hung Jacob's original sketch of the same building, now framed and preserved, a reminder of how far they had come. "We were so young," Olivia said, studying the painting and the sketch side by side. "So determined to protect ourselves from being hurt that we almost missed out on everything that mattered." "But we did not miss it," Jacob said, wrapping his arms around his wife from behind and resting his chin on her shoulder. "We found each other and we had the courage to try, and look what we built." "Look what we built," Olivia echoed, leaning back against him. "I love you, Jacob Turner. Thank you for taking the risk of loving me back." "Always," Jacob said, "for as long as we both shall live and probably beyond." "You opened my guarded heart, Olivia, and I will be grateful every day for the rest of my life that I let you." They stood together in the house they had shared for 3 decades, surrounded by the evidence of a life well lived and a love that had transformed them both. Two people who had learned that the greatest courage was not in staying safe, but in choosing to be vulnerable with the right person. The cowboy had believed hearts stayed guarded, but guarded became open with her, and in that opening, he had found everything he never knew he needed. It was, as far as either of them were concerned, the happiest ending they could have imagined, and they lived it together until their final days, surrounded by family and love, and the knowledge that they had chosen right when they chose each other.